Sister Soul, sister. Hey, sister Soul, sister. 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 Sister Soul.
Hello, I'm Hattie Bonds, and this is for women only, solamente para mujeres. And today we have a wonderful community member who's done and been a great advocate around integration, education, and basically social parity throughout the area and actually through the nation. And I think he comes from a generation of that, a long line of your dad was in that same kind of venue. And so we want to welcome Myron Orfield to the show today, Solamente para Mujeres. And thank you, Myron, for
Thank you.
coming. I
Thank
really
you for having
appreciate
me.
you
Yeah,
taking
thank you for
time
having
from
me.
your busy schedule
Happy to
from the
be here.
university. And we'd like for you to just to tell us a little bit about yourself first, and
Well,
we'll go with that.
I'm a professor at the law school, associate professor of law, and the director of the Institute on Race and Poverty. And I have been teaching law school for about since the early 90s. I was for a while a member of the legislature and was involved in affordable housing issues, trying to get affordable housing in particularly in newly developing suburbs and have a whole metropolitan area have build a variety of housing types, not just the central cities and the older suburbs doing all the work. Um, I've recently been working with the Institute on Race and Poverty on a study about social and racial segregation in the Twin Cities metropolitan area. And we've been working on these issues around the country.
Great, great. Um, our show, a lot of times, we would like to focus in on how this relates to women,
Yes.
the equity piece and that sort of thing, and then hit on some of the education pieces. So I'm wondering if you could kind of, you've always been such a great statistician. You know, through the years, I've been to workshops that you have held, and you've been very good at really giving us a real live picture of actually what's going on in our community as it relates to even race relations. And so if you could kind of just give us a broad brush glimpse of how is this and what's going on with women and that segregation piece and perhaps even the education piece. I know I connected with you when we went on a bus ride.
Yes, right.
And we were looking at the segregation in the suburban schools. And if you could talk a little bit about that and tell us what you already knew that you really
Well,
confirmed.
I think one of the things that's happening is in this metropolitan area, the schools are becoming more socially and racially segregated. And this means that more and more poor kids, particularly poor kids of color, are going to schools that have overwhelming percentages of poor kids. Most white kids, poor kids, are going to middle income schools. About 3/4 of poor white kids are going to schools that are mostly middle income kids. 3/4 middle income kids or 70% middle income kids. Most poor black and Latino kids are going to schools that are overwhelmingly poor. And this has effects on their ability to graduate, on their connections to college, higher education, and jobs. Now, single mothers are affected by these same trends. Um, the region is getting more racially segregated, but it's also getting more socially segregated. And when new communities at the edge of the region, communities that are dominated by white middle income kids, not only do black families and Latino families have very few chances to live there because of discrimination and because of lack of affordable housing, but so do single mothers. Just because there's not single mothers as a very powerful rule have less income.
Right.
They just don't have the two family or incomes, and it's hard enough to get into these housing markets in the suburbs if you have both people working. and it's really impossible for most single female-headed households because they can't afford it.
Right, right.
So as the region gets more racially and socially segregated, it means that female-headed households are much more likely to be in overwhelmingly poor schools and low opportunity schools.
And then yet there's about a quarter of white kids that are actually in these segments of
Yes.
schools that are low performing too
Yes,
as well.
poor white kids, because of they're not affected by racial discrimination, have more chances and choices.
Exactly.
And because their families are less discriminated against in the housing market, and they're less likely to be steered, they're less likely to be discriminated against in buying and selling transactions, they're less likely to experience mortgage discrimination.
So the white privilege does help out with those
tremendously.
kids.
Yes.
Tremendously, you said.
Yes.
It's interesting.
Yes, no, I mean, those white kids have a chance to get into schools that have more powerful connections to the,
And then they can easily blend in with the other
Yes.
kids that are middle and upper middle
Yes.
and high income.
they have a
white
chance
families.
to benefit by the opportunity structure that's created by these really strongly middle class kids. Very few kids, I mean, college counselors not only grade kids on their test scores, but also on what high schools they went to.
Absolutely.
And these are stratified. And kids often get pulled along by a middle income peer group if they're poor. And poor kids of color just don't have this chance.
That
or the
structure is not there
No.
for them. So it
No.
kind of creates a situation of
Yes.
greater disparity and,
Yes,
and larger gaps. And
Yes, it multiplies on itself.
yes.
In Appalachia, whites experience something like this. That's the only. There are very few places in the country where whites go to densely poor schools. Appalachia is one of them, and they have very little social mobility. And this is the rule for Black and Latino poor kids around the country. And it used to not be the rule here, but it's really catching up with the rest of the country in a fast way.
Well, I'm glad that you can say that and that you're expressing that, because that's exactly what I've been thinking over the last few years.
Yes.
I would say 5 to 10 years,
Yes.
is that it has gotten progressively worse here in our metro area. I can remember when I first came almost 20 years ago,
Yes.
it was not at all this kind of environment that we worked in.
No.
And people were trying to do some things that were creative, and they had strategies toward equity.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering, what is it that perhaps has catapulted this kind of situation? What's been the driving factor based upon your experience?
I think
in
that, like in many parts of the country, middle-income white areas have been resistant to middle-income and upper-income white areas have been resistant to going to school in a diverse setting. So they've opposed this and made this difficult throughout. And I think that there's always been some resistance, although there's a good piece of evidence that as whites have interracial contact, they become less prejudiced and less likely to exclude. That's a part of it. And then there's also been a growing sense, I think, in the country that African American and Latino leaders would rather have control over a separate system than to be in an integrated system.
and not have any power there and not have any
That's right.
influence in those areas. Okay.
So you
well,
had
that's fair.
kind of a perfect storm of white resistance to integrated schools, and then kind of a countervailing lack of interest in many leaders in the minority community. And there's been the civil rights movement that believes in racial integration has almost disappeared. So there's not there's nobody that advocates for this anymore. And Minneapolis and many of the older suburbs